Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. It's our honor to be here with you again, also with my excellent colleague, Antoniela Salguero. So we're going to talk to you today on the subject of the WTO agreement on government procurement, and also very much the treatment of government procurement in Latin American regional and bilateral trade agreements and related challenges for developing countries. So this is the subject for the day. Antonella, would you like to just briefly say hello? Or you're welcome to.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you again in this fourth session to discuss a topic that we are passionate about, that is the government procurement agreement of the WTO, and how we treat the provisions and chapters in terms of government procurement at a regional level. Rob has been working on this over 20 years at least, and I started getting engaged when I started working with Rob. So I'm so pleased to share this session with you today.
Thank you so much, Antonella, and it's a delight to be here with everyone. Next slide, please. So in this session, we are basically going to cover these 5 points. We'll begin by speaking of government procurement in the WTO, and specifically something called the WTO Agreement on Government Procurement. This is, for your information, this is not because I'm expecting anyone to run out and join the Agreement on Government Procurement, any of the 4 countries represented here, in the immediate future, though that would certainly be very welcome. But it's really because the WTO Agreement on Government Procurement serves as the template for all the chapters on government procurement that we see in regional and bilateral trade agreements in Latin America and around the world. So this is why we study first the WTO Agreement on Government Procurement. And then we'll go on and talk about the growing GPA membership of the agreement and its evolving global reach. And then we will get deeply into the subject of government procurement in Latin American regional and bilateral trade agreements, on which Antonella is an expert. And then we'll end by talking about the process for acceding to the GPA, but it's also a very similar process to negotiating a bilateral agreement or a regional agreement with a government procurement chapter. So we'll talk about this and what it involves, what are some possible transitional measures that can ease the process, and what are the potential benefits and costs. So this is the subject and the plan for this session. Next slide, please, Antonella. Okay, and we can go right to the next one. Okay, good. So government procurement in the WTO. This is just a single slide. I can tell you there are really 3 dimensions of this that I would like you to be aware of, but it's the 3rd one that is by far the most important. So the first is what we call the multilateral work on transparency in government procurement. This was a project in the WTO, which involved all of the WTO's members. Okay, so including many members from Latin America. But this work was put on hold in 2002. It may or may not ever come back. So we're not going to worry about it for today's purposes, although you're welcome to ask me about it in questions if you would like. Secondly, there is a project on the procurement of services under the WTO General Agreement on Trade-in Services, which we refer to sometimes as the GATS agreement. And this also, it is there and potentially, in principle, all WTO members including in Latin America, could be asked to participate in that work. And the European Union is a champion of that work and wants that work to move ahead. But to be candid with you, at the moment, it's not moving ahead. And so we're also not going to worry in this course very much about the work on services procurement in the GATS. Rather, and here we come to the important part, what we are going to focus on is what is called the Plurilateral Agreement on Government Procurement. And this is, as I told you, even when we were first beginning, this will be our main focus, at least with respect to WTO work on government procurement. That's because this is, in fact, a very dynamic area of work in the WTO, which is moving ahead. And there is still a hope that, very much there's a hope that eventually countries from Latin America will join this agreement. This is one reason for telling you about this. But really, as I said, the main reason for telling you about this is that this agreement on government procurement, what I will refer to as the WTO GPA, GPA is Government Procurement Agreement. This is actually the template that is used by countries, pretty much all countries, when they negotiate bilateral or regional agreements on international trade that include chapters on government procurement. So that's really the core reason why we're studying the GPA, because it gives us a gateway to understand the same disciplines that we see in regional trade agreements. And I'm aware, of course, that one or two of you are involved in what we call the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This contains a government procurement chapter that is based on the GPA. Likewise, the Colombia-US FTA, this is the chapter on government procurement in that agreement is based on the GPA, the WTO GPA. So the point I'm making is there's lots of reasons, and it's good for all of you to be aware of the GPA, even if, for whatever reasons, your countries choose not to join it for the time being, which is perfectly okay. Incidentally, there is a hope and expectation that Brazil may be joining the GPA. It has applied to join the GPA, so that's another reason to be aware of this agreement. Okay, next slide, please. And the next one. Okay, great. So now we're going to teach for 15 minutes, perhaps 20 minutes on the GPA itself, what it is, what are the main elements of the agreement, and eventually, later in the presentation, we'll come to the issue of why you might consider joining it. Why do countries participate in this? So the GPA is a internationally recognized tool. In fact, it's the broadest and most encompassing agreement dealing with government trade and government procurement in the world. It does provide access to the other GPA parties' procurement markets. That means that contractors, suppliers in each participating country can bid on the contracts in all the other participating countries. This is one feature of the agreement. We, Antonella and I, and certainly and our former colleagues at the WTO, and really all the parties, believe that the agreement also helps to ensure improved value for money in each participating members. Means countries' procurements. This it does by strengthening transparency and competition, really. And we also believe, and we see internationally that this agreement is increasingly used as a template for reforms and as a tool for promoting good governance, and even as a tool, as an anti-corruption tool in the covered procurement markets. And we will speak about all of these features in due course. Okay, now, having said this, given this little blurb about what the WTO GPA seeks to do, I do want you to know that this is what we call a plurilateral agreement within the WTO system. That means that not all WTO members participate. And currently, for your own reasons, none of the 4 countries that are represented here in this seminar are participating in the GPA. But as I mentioned to you, some other countries are looking at the GPA, in Latin America, including Brazil. And I do hope that other countries will look at it eventually. And then, but again, even if you never do that, the main reason I'm teaching this is because this is the template for the regional trade agreements and the bilateral agreements that deal with government procurement. Okay, so and that's the point we make at the bottom, that the GPA has vital synergies with countries' national legislation and with regional and bilateral trade agreements in Latin America and around the world. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my quick way of teaching what I refer to as the main elements of the agreement. Of course, I certainly hope that some of you will take the time to actually get a copy of it. Antonella, can you hold that up? Yes, thank you. So Antonella is holding up a copy of the agreement on government procurement. This is published by the WTO. And maybe at the end of the course, Veronica, I will suggest that we provide a link to this in addition to...
I'm going to include the GPA's link in the chat box.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. That's perfect. Okay, I think we need to go back to the previous slide. Somehow we... no. There we are. Yes. Okay, so what are the 5 main elements of the agreement? I will teach this very quickly. It'll be easy. One is, like all WTO agreements, it contains rules on what we call national treatment and non-discrimination. And in this case, in the GPA, it's non-discrimination and national treatment with respect to participation in each party's covered procurement markets. And what that means in practice is that, well, as I told you, that suppliers or bidders from any of the participating countries, any of the countries that are members of the agreement, can bid on contracts in all the other parties' markets. And this is subject to some exceptions and limitations that are built into the schedules to the agreement, which we'll come to in a moment. But basically, that's the core idea of this agreement, that when you're in the agreement, so, a supplier from Peru or Colombia would have the right to bid on contracts in Canada, in Japan, in all the countries of the European Union, and so forth. That's the number one kind of concept of the agreement. Now, the second main element of the agreement is what we call the market access schedules, or the coverage schedules. And the formal legal name for this is the Appendix 1 annexes. I apologize for all these 3 different names for the same thing, but I just want you to know them, because if you go into a negotiation, some people will be calling them the coverage schedules. Some people will be calling them the market access schedules. and some will be calling them the Appendix 1 annexes. So it's good for you to know these three terms, but they refer to exactly the same thing. And these specify which ministries are covered by the agreement, which services are covered, which goods are covered, and also something that's important, which is the thresholds that will apply under the agreement, okay? And the thresholds are important because they limit the impact of this agreement. It means that it basically is a way that it ensures that the agreement mainly covers higher valued contracts. And most of the contracts, this is an important point to know, most of the contracts that are of interest to local suppliers and certainly to SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, most of those will be below the thresholds of the agreement and therefore won't be affected by international competition when you join the GPA. Okay, the third main element then is what we call the procedural rules of the agreement. These are minimum standards. They cover key aspects of the procurement process, and their purpose is to ensure transparency and open competition. So, for example, they include provisions on tendering procedures, on qualification of suppliers, time limits, documentation, opening of tenders and contract award procedures, really all of the kind of normal features of procurement processes in most or all countries. Next slide, please. Okay, and so and the good thing is there's only 5 main elements here. And to make it easy for you, I'm going to just repeat once only what I've already said. So number 1 is the rules on non-discrimination and national treatment. That's about the right to bid across borders on contracts. Number 2 is the market access schedules. Number 3 is the procedural rules. And now we come to the final 2. The fourth one is concerns what we call enforcement of the agreement. Okay, and there are 2 enforcement mechanisms, one of which is far more important in practice. So one of them is there is the WTO dispute settlement understanding, and that does apply to the GPA. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is the process that countries can engage if they feel that their rights are being denied by another WTO member, rights specified in a relevant agreement. So that procedure is available, but it's Antonella, sorry, we just skipped a slide. Yeah, thanks. That the WTO dispute settlement understanding is available, but it's rarely used in this area of government procurement. And the reason for that is we have something else that works more quickly, and that is what we call the domestic review procedures or the remedy systems. And in the US, they call these bid protest systems. This is something I'm pretty sure all of you have, all of the participants here have some form of domestic review procedure. It's also called an appeal mechanism. And it basically, or a complaint mechanism, it's basically the idea that a supplier who feels that he or she has been wrongly treated, perhaps excluded or denied a contract for improper reasons, that supplier there must be a place that they can go and make a complaint and be confident that that complaint will be reviewed in a way that is impartial and will truly resolve the situation if something has been done wrong. So that's the idea of domestic review. It's a very important part of the GPA. Most countries, in my experience, already have this in one shape or another, but the WTO GPA has some special requirements regarding the independence of the appeal procedure, regarding the transparency, regarding the effectiveness, relevant time periods, and so forth. Okay, so now we've covered 4 out of the 5. So I promised this would not be too difficult, and there we are, 4 out of 5. And the 5th one is a built-in mandate for future negotiations to improve the agreement and broaden its reach. So what this means is that the GPA, the WTO Agreement on Government Procurement, is, in effect, it's something that can always be improved upon. It's not meant to stand still. And in practice, it does not stand still. As recently as 2012, it's more than a decade ago now, but in WTO terms, it's not so long ago. As recently as 2012, the agreement was renegotiated. And I'm going to just share with you a few highlights of that renegotiation. Eventually, there will be a further renegotiation. So the whole idea is that this agreement should be continuously, progressively updated and modernized. And that's a good thing. Because actually, as all of you are aware, changes occur, improvements occur in procurement procedures and even in technology. And it's important to be able to reflect this in the agreement as it occurs. Okay, and the parties have done a pretty good job of updating the agreement as necessary. Next slide, please. Okay, and next one. Thank you. So this is just a couple of quick slides on the renegotiation that occurred in 2012. And this is now the version of the agreement that is in force. The old one has kind of faded into WTO history. But in 2012, there was a renegotiation. The entire GPA text was overhauled and modernized. Okay. But it still incorporates those 5 main elements that I told you about, and those are still the heart of the agreement. We also expanded the market access commitments at that time, and the parties also reached agreement on a so-called package of work programs on issues such as small and medium-sized enterprises and sustainability. And these are concerns that were shared by all of the parties to the agreement to promote the role of SMEs and to promote sustainability. And this is kind of ongoing work, and I think will eventually be the result, or will be treated in future amendments to the agreement to ensure that the agreement effectively promotes sustainability and does not stand in the way of countries' efforts to, for example, deal with climate change issues. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I've just said to you, the core principles of the revised text are the same as the existing one. Those are non-discrimination, transparency, and procedural fairness, and those are delivered through those 5 elements that I mentioned. Nonetheless, the revised text does contain some important improvements. One is it was just updated completely and written to be more user-friendly. Number 2 is the role of electronic procurement tools was properly reflected in the agreement. And number 3, actually, the agreement was revised to provide enhanced flexibility for the parties' procurement authorities, especially when electronic tools are used, okay? Which they now are used by really essentially all of the parties, and of course, you know, I think all of you use electronic tools in your procurement processes, at least to one extent or another. Next slide, please. So three more revisions that are important and kind of show the continuing relevance of this agreement. One is that the GPA's significance for good governance and the global struggle against corruption was more explicitly recognized in the 2012 version of the agreement. And the agreement now actually requires countries to carry out their covered procurements in ways that avoid conflicts of interest and prevent corrupt practices. This doesn't mean that countries are expected to eradicate those practices completely. This would be an unrealistic expectation. We do see, sadly, we do see corrupt practices, even in the EU, even in the United States. It happens. Okay, so nobody is imagining that corruption will be eradicated completely. But what the agreement is telling you is you must build in some safeguards. You must follow procedures that will help to prevent corruption in the procurement process and will avoid or at least help to guard against conflicts of interest. And that's a really important feature of the agreement. Additionally, the revised agreement contains new language to ensure its compatibility with what we call green procurement or sustainability. And of course, just recently, we had a big discussion on sustainability in this course. And we all agree that that's a really important priority for our procurement systems, really, to contribute to the global struggle for sustainability and to climate change mitigation. So basically, in 2012, new language was incorporated in the agreement already to ensure and to signal that the parties were receptive to green procurement and sustainability. And lastly, in 2012, the parties adopted revised and improved transitional measures for developing countries that accede to the agreement. And some of those may be of interest to you, so we're going to return to that subject towards the end of this session. Okay, so next slide, please. And next one. Okay, and so this is just a slide that summarizes who is in this agreement. Okay, it's a lot of countries. It's 48, currently it's 48 WTO member countries. Okay, this includes all of the EU member states and the other countries that are listed there. Okay, and very soon there'll be a 49th one. That's North Macedonia, which has just joined the agreement. 9 other countries are in the process of acceding to the agreement, including China, and also the other ones mentioned there, and Brazil. Brazil, now it notes here that Brazil recently withdrew its GPA accession offer. That was what happened when the new government took power in Brazil. But that does not mean that Brazil is withdrawing its interest to join the agreement. It means just that the new government felt that the offer that was on the table was not appropriate and it wanted to make some changes, but it has not actually withdrawn its application to join the agreement. So I still believe that in the future that Brazil will eventually join. I think that, and I hope some of you in your respective countries here in this seminar will consider joining. You know, remember what I've said, that, so for example, like Colombia, because of its bilateral agreements with the US and the European Union, you've already actually put in place the GPA style disciplines. So it would be actually quite easy for you to accede to the GPA, I would suggest. So this is something that we can think about and come back to. Okay, and then, but currently there are also in this agreement, we have parties that are the full members of the GPA, but we also have observer governments, and the observer governments include Ecuador, for example, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. I think my excellent colleague Antonella was helpful in facilitating the process for Paraguay to become an observer. So, and being an observer is a good deal. It's completely cost-free. It involves zero obligations. You just get to come to the committee and show your interest, and other countries will kind of express hopes that you will eventually join as a party. But there's no duty to do that. There's no obligation. Next slide, please. Okay, and so, and I think this is the final kind of slide on introduction to the GPA. And so what I want to stress here in this slide, what we are stressing, is that the reach of this GPA agreement is broader than just the membership, just the set of parties that are already full members of the agreement. How could that be? Well, reason number one is what we have at the top and what I've already told you. The GPA is the model or the template for the chapters on government procurement that we see in regional and bilateral trade agreements around the world. Okay, this includes most significant EU regional agreements. Also, we could have said also US bilateral agreements, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, okay, which of course Peru is already a member of that, and I hope and expect that other countries will consider joining. So the second point is that the GPA is an essential benchmark for national procurement reforms in countries around the world. And how does that work? Well, basically, countries that are reforming their legislation, which all countries do eventually, their procurement laws and regulations, they typically look to international benchmarks. And the GPA is one of the international benchmarks, one of the key benchmarks that countries look to, even if they're not a party to the GPA. And the other one being the UNCITRAL model law on public procurement. And fortunately, this is the third point on the page, the GPA is carefully harmonized with the UNCITRAL model law on public procurement. Some of you may be more familiar with the UNCITRAL model law on public procurement, okay? And that's a really, really useful thing. And what I'm sharing with you now is very deliberately, by intention, the UNCITRAL model law on public procurement has now been harmonized with the WTO GPA so that you can use the UNCITRAL model law. I'm not going to say they're interchangeable. The UNCITRAL model law has more details in it. The GPA is more of a kind of stripped down set of minimum standards, but nonetheless, they're carefully harmonized and fully compatible with each other. Okay, and the GPA now is also referenced in the World Bank's procurement guidelines. This also was not the case a decade ago. It's a result of work done and liaison and coordination between carried out by the secretariats of the different organizations at the request of and with the support of their respective members. So the GPA, the point I'm making to here is that the GPA has an impact beyond just the members of the GPA, beyond just those 48 countries that are full parties to the agreement, okay? And that's again, as I keep saying, that's why we believe it's very important for you to be aware of this agreement, even if you don't choose to become a party to the agreement at the moment, which is perfectly okay. Antonella, I think this concludes this segment. And I think now you're going to take up the and share some insights and developments regarding the regional and bilateral trade agreements in Latin America. So over to you. Thanks everyone for listening to this introduction to the GPA, on which Antonella will definitely be building in her presentation of the Latin American regional and bilateral trade agreements. Over to you, Antonella.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to see you again to talk about this topic. We speak about the GPA extensively, but now we are going to see how we treat provisions, government procurement provisions in regional and bilateral trade agreements. I'm going to leave aside the GPAs to focus on these trade agreements that open markets. They are liberalization tools. They can be benchmarks for reform and good governance in government procurement. Free trade agreements, particularly those that have chapters, government procurement chapters, have become one of the main vehicles to expand the rules and access to government procurement markets, especially for those countries that are non-members to the GPA. This trend is increasing. So today, more than half of the agreements signed and ratified contain provisions or chapters related to government procurement. As Rob said before, most of these chapters are based on the GPA, and it guarantees the minimum standards such as non-discrimination, most favored nation, national treatment, transparency, procedural fairness, market competition, among others. Next one. I want to say here that these government procurement chapters and market opening is just the tip of the iceberg, because based on liberalizing the market and market openness, they have positive implications on public procurement systems. For instance, things related to higher competitions and the chance to have value for money, also good governance, integrity, anti-corruption practices, opportunities for reform. Once you accede to these agreements, you need to amend or reform your legislation so that they can be implemented, enforced in a harmonized manner. And you also have the possibility to influence the terms of new acceding economies in the case of plurilaterals. So this gives you an additional benefit, because when at the time of decision making, generally, government procurement provisions varying in their coverage and scope. And we see three categories that we find in these agreements. The first one, that is in old agreements, is where there's no mention or no coverage at all in terms of government procurement. The second group is having provisions on government procurement, but they are not detailed. They are kind of shallow. They say basically that it's a good thing to have, And maybe in the future, we might incorporate government procurement and renegotiate this chapter and revise it in some years. But there's no specifics about minimum standards, coverage, so on and so forth. And then the final group has detailed, substantive chapter and provisions regarding market opening, transparency, procedural questions. They need to have domestic review mechanisms, among any others. These are the deeper agreements. We speak about shallow and deep agreements. This is a World Bank's terminology, and that we use these terms to make the difference here. So these shallow measures can be reflected in the Israel and Turkey TLC or FTA. It's just one article with 2 paragraphs, limited only to the fact that the parties will have into consideration the liberalization of their public procurement and building a joint committee to revise the progress on an annual basis. So it's a commitment for liberalizing the market, the government procurement market, in the future. Now, we see some more substantive provisions here. One of the common elements found here, and I mean non-discrimination. This is the cornerstone that sets the path for market openness in terms of government procurement. Another common elements refer to transparency, due processes, public procurement mechanisms, coverage found in the annexes to the agreement, dispute resolution mechanisms, and some other new issues, such as including SMEs and process integrity for anti-corruption practices. Bob, do you want to come in here?
Just to say, Antonella, if I may, very quickly, notice everyone that this list of common elements is pretty much identical to the list of the 5 main elements that I showed you, or the 6 main elements in the WTO GPA. It's really the same, actually. Even the new issues part, because there it's really sustainability and good governance that we're talking about.
Absolutamente. Esto, como habías mencionado, el ACP es un texto base para los
GPA is the benchmark for other agreements, and they are government procurement chapters. GPA does not have a specific sustainable government procurement chapter, but they have some mention to the fact that we can include environmental matters or issues as discussed on our last session. These common elements and its similarity with the GPA, now this opens the way to the provisions, individual provisions. The cornerstone, as I said, is and it will continue to be non-discrimination. What do we mean by this? It's not to discriminate against foreign bidders or foreign companies that want to participate in bidding processes in specific countries, but also not to discriminate against companies established in a countries, but have foreign capitals, domestic nationals selling foreign products. That's another case. So discrimination is about products and services, discriminate against nationalities or operating capital of the company. This should be borne in mind. Non-discrimination is not just a foreign company coming to a specific country, but it's related to the other things that I mentioned before.
Otra disposición común, como había
Another
mencionado,
common provision
está relacionada a la transparencia y los requisitos de
relates to
transparencia.
transparency.
Esto se refiere a lo que sería información, publicación de los
Information
llamados,
and
publicación de las
publication of
adjudicaciones, que
bidding,
la
call for
información
bids,
esté publicada
the
en tiempo y
information
forma,
to
que
be
no esté
published in
publicada
due
en un
time and
tiempo
form,
menor al debido para que las empresas puedan tener acceso a
for
esta
companies to be
información,
able to access this
información sobre los
information
pliegos, los requisitos,
about tender
etcétera. Sobre
documentation,
todo, esa
requirements.
información que está
This
publicada
information
en las redes o en lo que serían las
posted
plataformas
on
de
the
las autoridades de compras
networks
públicas esté
or
publicada
government
sin
procurement
un
platforms
costo
needs to
alguno para las
be
empresas interesadas.
published at
Generalmente esto
no
viene a ser
cost
interesante
for the
porque hay muchas
interested
veces que de
parties.
repente suelen tener
This is an
algunos
important
programas
point
un costo
because
para
some
empresas
platforms
participantes en
might
estas
entail a
informaciones. Entonces,
cost.
es importante que esa
So
información
it's
esté publicada
important
de forma
for this
transparente y
information to be
competitiva.
transparently published
Otra cuestión también que
and free
encontramos
of
en los
cost.
acuerdos está relacionado al debido proceso. A
Then
los
the due
estándares mínimos
process,
que deben ser
minimum standards
respetados,
that need to
incluidos,
be
por ejemplo,
observed,
plazos
including
para presentar las ofertas o bien el plazo para
time
presentar
limits for
impugnaciones o
submitting
excepciones a la
offers
autoridad.
or time limits for
Generalmente, el ACP
challenging.
provee un plazo mínimo de 10 días
The GPA
para la
provides for a
presentación
10-day
de
period to
impugnaciones o revisiones,
present or
este
submit
plazo se
reviews or
utiliza a
challenges,
nivel
and
internacional en
this
distintos
period
acuerdos.
is
Un plazo
used
menor a esto, que
internationally.
sí hay, generalmente está
A re-
considerado como no una buena práctica a nivel
Having
internacional.
a period that is not a 10-day
Ahora,
period is
otras
not
cuestiones que
considered a good
están
practice.
prohibidas por los acuerdos
Another
internacionales
things
son
that
lo que
are
serían las
banned,
prácticas de compensaciones u offsets
these
o la
are
práctica de tener
ban on
programas
offsets
con
or
margen de
having
preferencia o con preferencia de precios
preferences,
para
price
ofertantes
preferences
domésticos.
for domestic
Generalmente vemos que
bidders.
sí, la mayoría de los países tienen
Most
cierto
of the
margen de preferencia
countries
para algunos
have some sort
sectores,
of
algunos
preferences for
rubros,
some
y lo
sectors.
que buscamos acá con estos
And
acuerdos
what
justamente es
do we
liberalizar el
seek
mercado en el
here
sentido que
is to
estos no sean unos
liberalize the
obstáculos
market. This
innecesarios
should
a
not
la
be an
competencia
unnecessary
internacional.
hurdle to
Entonces, ¿cuáles son los
international
ejemplos?
competition.
En el caso, por ejemplo, de países en vía de desarrollo, y como vamos a ver más adelante,
In the
hay
case of
ciertas
developing
medidas de
countries,
transición que
there are
permiten
some
estas
transitional
medidas
measures
medidas de preferencia. No obstante,
that
siempre se
perpetuate
busca que
these
estas
preference measures.
estén por
However,
afuera y las reservas no sean parte del acuerdo.
we want to
Como había
have these
mencionado Rob, todo
reservations
depende de la
out of the
negociación.
agreement. As
Entonces, en
Rob
la
says,
negociación se dice que las
everything is
partes
subject to
contratantes
negotiation,
podrán
meaning
tener
that the
su
contracting
programa de
parties might
compensación
have their
en
offset
su acuerdo de
program in this
desarrollo
sector or this
industrial
other sector because
bajo
this
el
helps
acuerdo
to develop the
puede
industries
incluirse.
for some reason or
Como
another.
dije, esto
It might
depende
be
de la
included,
negociación
but
entre las
this
partes.
relies on the
Otra cuestión
parties'
también que hablamos
negotiations.
en las disposiciones o en los artículos en materia de compras públicas se refiere a la
Another
contratación
thing to be
directa,
taken into
a la
account is
licitación restringida,
direct
como es llamada
contracts
en el ACP, o bien también la contratación por vía de
or
excepción, que es la que hablamos cuando la
hiring through
autoridad contratante
exception.
directamente recurre a un
This
ofertante para
happens
proveer
when
los
the
bienes o
authority,
servicios
which
que
is
deben ser
needing
suministrados.
a good or a
Lo que acá
service,
buscamos es
resorts
que
or
esto
contacts directly
sea la
the
excepción,
bidder or the
que las
supplier,
compras
rather.
públicas
So,
abiertas y con competencia
open public
sean la regla y
procurement
las
with
contrataciones directas
competition
sean la excepción, en el
have to
sentido
be
de que
the rule
solamente
for
puedan ser
competition.
implementadas bajo la prerrogativa de la autoridad, bajo ciertas excepciones, como por ejemplo las
So,
contingencias,
only
como
some
vimos en el caso de la pandemia,
exceptions
que
may
se
be
realizaron
accepted. For
muchas
example, the case of urgency,
excepciones
as in
también,
the
excepciones,
pandemic,
cuestiones relacionadas a propiedad intelectual, porque hay un cierto
intellectual
componente
property,
inicial que
because there
no puede
is a
ser proveído por las
component which
empresas,
cannot
o
be
por ejemplo en el caso que se hizo un
furnished or
llamado
provided by another
abierto, pero no
business.
se presentaron empresas
There
para
may be an open
suministrar este bien o
call
servicio. Entonces, en
for
ese caso, bajo la permisividad de la
presentations,
autoridad,
and
se va a la
there are
contratación
no
directa o
bidders.
por vía de la
You are in a
excepción.
situation in
También,
which you
aparte de la
can
contratación directa, también
apply an
tenemos lo que se
exception.
refiere el ACP
With
como la
direct
licitación selectiva, en el
contracts,
cual la autoridad competente
the authority
invita a ciertos proveedores que
may
cumplen con las condiciones
invite
para proveer
certain
dichos bienes y
suppliers
servicios.
which
También
comply
eso
with
está
all the
permitido, pero no
qualifications.
siempre bajo
That is
ciertas
allowed
condiciones que
for,
se debe cumplir para
but
evitar
under certain
justamente
conditions so as to
casos de tener menos
preclude
competitividad, menos número de competidores, lo cual puede
from
llevar a
a
casos de
limited
corrupción y
number of
limitar la
bidders,
posibilidad de obtener valor por dinero.
and this
Siendo que las disposiciones
as
también tenemos
does not
cuestiones
have to
relacionadas a
limit
las
value for
especificaciones
money.
técnicas,
There are other
En este
clauses
sentido, el
related
título menciona
to
que estas
technical
normas harán
specifications.
o diseñarán o aplicarán especificaciones que
So
generen
the
obstáculos. Estas tienen
specifications
que estar más
do not have
relacionadas
to
a los
stand
términos
for
funcionales
obstacles.
más que a
They have to
descriptivos,
be related
como
to the
también, por ejemplo, la prohibición de
functions
usar
of
marcas
a
o
certain
propiedad
good.
intelectual que pueda
So
limitar la competencia
certain
de otras
trademarks
empresas
or
interesadas
certain,
en
for example,
participar del
goods or
llamado.
services and
También
intellectual
tenemos
property
disposiciones, y esto
have
también
to be
está
banned.
relacionado dentro de las nuevas cuestiones que
And we
mencionamos, que es la
said
integridad en el
a
proceso.
new concept is the
Una
integrity in the
característica muy
concept.
relevante de la
One of
CITES
the
es que
features
el
of the
primer
GPA
acuerdo de la OMC
is
que
that it is the
menciona de manera
first
expresa
agreement
la
by the
corrupción y el
WTO
conflicto de interés.
that has mentioned
No hay otros
corruption and
acuerdos
conflict
OMC
of
que sancionen
interest.
cuestiones o
There is
leyes que
no
pueden ser
other
tomadas para
agreement
eliminar la
within the
corrupción. Y esto es algo que es
WTO
muy
which
especial a la CITES
aims at
también, como
avoiding
un modelo
corruption.
para los demás
That's the reason
acuerdos,
why
es que
GPA
se
is
ve
so
reflejado
special,
en los distintos acuerdos bilaterales
Mhm.
o
and that
regionales.
is reflected in the different bilateral
Generalmente
agreements
suelen ser
signed by the
cuestiones o
parties.
artículos muy generales, pero sí ya vemos, por ejemplo, en algunos casos, como sería el
There may
acuerdo de
be
libre
some
comercio entre
cases
Chile y
as a
Estados
free
Unidos,
trade
donde
between
sí
Chile
hay
and the United
disposiciones
States,
específicas
in which you
relacionadas a
can
la no
read
corrupción. También
specific
es importante
clauses
notar
related to
en el
the
sentido, ya que hablamos de la corrupción,
non-corruption. As we are
lo que
speaking
sería
about
el INTAL,
corruption,
que es el Acuerdo
I
Anticorrupción de las
may
Naciones Unidas,
refer
y
to the
que este acuerdo está
UNCAA, which
ratificado
is the United Nations
específicamente por los
Agreement
4
Against
países
Corruption, which
que
is
están
signed
están
by the
participando en
4
en esta
countries
charla. Eso también
Mhm.
which are
es
represented in this
vamos a decir, un
meeting.
mandamiento, una obligación adicional
This
que
is an
también
additional
puede ser
mandate
incluida en estos
that
acuerdos,
may
todo lo
be
relacionado
included in all
a la no
these
corrupción
agreements
y evitar el
dealing
conflicto de
with
intereses en materia de
corruption
compras
and
públicas.
avoiding conflict of interest.
La siguiente cuestión se relaciona a lo que sería tener, o sea, las provisiones también pueden exigir la
Clauses may
implementación de sistemas de
also
protesta, impugnación,
refer
revisión
to the systems
la
of
necesidad de
claims,
recursos
how
legales para
claims
ello.
are. Rob, you want to say something?
If you don't mind, just another very quick point. I'm so glad you mentioned the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and which, as you point out, that's a very interesting thing that the GPA of 2012 actually cross-references the UN Convention. And furthermore, the UN Convention, which, as you rightly point out, the 4 countries here have signed, actually contains provisions, more specific provisions dealing with government procurement processes, which again are kind of modeled on the GPA to a significant extent. So this is actually another example that we can mention here of the broadening reach of the GPA. Even some of the provisions in the UNCAC, like for example, the UN Convention places a lot of emphasis on independent domestic review systems. This is basically an idea that is borrowed from the GPA. So thanks. I just wanted to interject that. It's a very good point you make.
Gracias, Rob. Bueno, siguiendo con lo que estábamos hablando, como dije,
As
tenemos
we were
la cuestión
saying,
del sistema de protesta de decisiones
we
justamente
have
como una
a
forma
system
extra del monitoreo, no
to
solamente para
protest
revisar decisiones
bids,
que pueden estar equivocadas,
not only
licitaciones que
to
pueden estar mal
review
gestionadas,
decisions which are
sino
wrong
también una
or
forma extra como para ayudar
wrong
en la lucha
drafting,
de la
whatever,
corrupción, de los conflictos de
but something
intereses,
that may
una
help us
forma
to
más
avoid
de monitoreo
corruption,
para el
conflict
sistema
of
de compras
interest. It's
públicas.
another way of reviewing
Artículos
public
siguientes
procurement.
pueden incluir también medidas
There
de
are other
transición.
units which
Generalmente
may
las medidas de
include
transición están disponibles para los
temporary
países en vías de
measures
desarrollo y los países menos
which are available
desarrollados,
to
como también
developing
los miembros de la
countries and
CITES,
developed
y ya hablaremos un
countries
poco más
together with
adelante. Y
GPA.
también tenemos las
And
cuestiones nuevas
I'm going
relacionadas
to
a
refer
combustibles
this
estables, incluir, por ejemplo,
in a
normas
few
o
minutes. And
reglas que
we can
apoyen o
also
faciliten la inclusión
have a
de
look at
combustibles
the sustainable
en las compras públicas.
procurement, which
Todos estos
is
10
the
puntos que
support
hablamos
to the
generalmente se refieren también a los
SMBs.
estándares mínimos, vamos a decir, las
All
reglas
these are
mínimas
the
que deben ser
10
cumplidas
minimal
para
standards that have to be
cumplir
complied
las
with
obligaciones del acuerdo. La
so as
segunda
to
parte de los
make
acuerdos,
the
como había mencionado Rob, se
GPA
refiere a lo que serían
enforceable.
los
The
anexos,
second
la
part
cobertura
is
del qué está
the
cubierto.
annexes, that is, what is covered by all these regulations.
Todo el sistema de compras públicas en general
All
en nuestro
these
país,
regulations
sino que se
do
refieren
not
solamente o abarcan
encompass the
solamente
whole
aquellas
universe of
entidades y
procurement.
aquellos bienes y servicios
It
que están
refers to
cubiertos por el
goods,
acuerdo.
services,
Por
and
eso es que es tan
institutions which are
importante en la
covered
negociación
by
y en
the
la
agreement.
negociación
That's
qué es
why
lo que vamos a
it is
cubrir.
so
Vamos a cubrir
important to
entidades
remember what
centrales,
we're
vamos a
going to
cubrir
cover.
entidades federales,
For example,
entidades
public,
centrales,
federal
municipios,
institutions,
ciudades,
municipalities.
vamos a cubrir qué tipo de bienes.
What
O sea,
kind of
tenemos una lista
goods
negativa.
are
O
we
sea, tenemos una
going to
lista
apply?
positiva.
A negative
Hasta qué
list
punto abrimos nuestro
or
mercado,
a
cuál es el
positive
nivel de
schedule?
apertura que tienen los otros
What
países
is
de la
the
región
level of
para
opening
tener
of
un
the
nivel de
other countries in the
competitividad.
region so
Y
as to
también
have, for
determinamos
example,
umbrales. Como
the same
el
treatment
ACP, pues
and
lo hablamos
thresholds as
acá
well?
en la primera
At the
charla justamente,
GPA,
que tiene unos ciertos
at the
umbrales
first meeting, we
basados en
spoke
una
about certain
canasta creada por el
thresholds which
Fondo
are
Monetario
based on
y
a
que es
basket
la
created
base
by the
justamente para las
IMF,
negociaciones. Pero lo
which
que
is the
hacemos con estos
foundation for
acuerdos
this
es que
kind
estos
of
acuerdos van
negotiations.
un paso más
All these
allá del
agreements
ACP
go
y tienen umbrales
beyond
más
the
bajos. Esto
GPA,
significa
and the
que más
thresholds, their
contratos
thresholds
suelen
are
estar
lower. This
cubiertos
means
por acuerdos
that there are
bilaterales
more
y
contracts
regionales
which are
que
covered
por
by
los posibles
regional and
acuerdos de
bilateral
negociación
agreements
entre los países.
than by
Por eso es tan
the
importante también tener en
GPA.
cuenta estos
That's
acuerdos.
another
Y como
thing you have
estamos
to bear in
aprendiendo,
mind when
dentro de
dealing
los
with these
países que no son
agreements.
parte de la ACP, estos también son parte de otros
The
acuerdos.
parties
Porque
to
estos
the
acuerdos
GPA
bilaterales, estos
are
acuerdos regionales
parties
le
to
permiten
other
abrir
agreements,
aún más
bilateral, for
sus mercados de
example.
compras públicas.
Why? Because all these
Un
agreements
ejemplo
allow
que
them
quise poner
to
acá y
open
seguramente
their
el doctor
markets.
Bonici va a estar hablando más adelante es la Alianza del Pacífico porque creo que él
Dr.
siempre
Bonici is
participó
going
de
to
todos estos
speak about,
instrumentos.
most
La
probably,
Alianza del
which is
Pacífico incluye un
the
capítulo sobre contratación pública, así como también el anexo que dice exactamente qué
the
entidades, qué
TPP.
bienes y cuál es el umbral que va a estar cubierto.
And
Dos cosas a rescatar.
we're
Uno,
going to deal with the
que
threshold as well.
el capítulo de materia de compras públicas
What about
está
public
basado
procurement,
en el
Chapter
CPTPP,
8?
el acuerdo
It is
progresivo
based
y
on the
comprensivo
progressive
que había
agreement
tratado
and
con el Reino Unido, el cual a su vez otra vez
comprehensive and
está
progressive
basado
agreement
en
for
los
the
estándares mínimos del
TPP
ACP.
as
Entonces acá vemos justamente cómo en la Alianza del
presented.
Pacífico el mismo texto está
So
basado
here
también
you
en el
have the
texto
same
base del
text,
acuerdo de
which
contratación
is
pública de la OMC.
based upon the
¿Y por qué
same
menciono esta alianza
text drafted
específico?
by
Porque
the
acá también tuvimos la
WTO.
negociación que tuvo lugar entre estos cuatro
If we
países. Estos
consider
actualizaron
the
estándares ya
negotiation between
existentes
3 or
en
4
cuestiones
countries,
relacionadas a
they
la no
updated
discriminación, transparencia, uso de menos
standards in terms of
medios para la
transparency,
contratación,
electronic
procedimientos de
tools for
impugnación.
contracts,
También
the
se solicitaron y
procedures
promovieron
for
normas que
bid
ayudan a la
protest,
participación de pymes
and
y también se
also the
ampliaron las
participation of
coberturas que son relacionadas a las
SMBs,
entidades
and the
cubiertas
coverage
y se
was
eliminaron
related
ciertas reservas que
to
existían antes en
the
sus propias legislaciones.
other institutions and the reserves that
Otro
may
ejemplo que
exist
traigo acá son los distintos
within their
acuerdos firmados por los
legislations.
Estados Unidos
I'm showing you
con
here a
requisitos
list of
en
all the
materia de
agreements
compras
signed by the
públicas.
members
Lo que vemos
with
acá son
different
dos cosas que había mencionado.
public procurement
Uno,
provisions. What
que los
can you
umbrales negociados
take
entre
from
estos
the list?
países
You can see that the
vemos que son en
thresholds
muchos casos
are in
menores
many
a
cases
los del ACP, lo que
lower
significa
than
que la
those in
cobertura
the
de
GPA.
estos
This
acuerdos
means
es
that the
aún mayor que la
coverage of
cobertura del
these
ACP.
agreements
Significa que
is
más entidades están cubiertas y
bigger
más
than
contratos
that of
están
GPA. That
cubiertos
means that there are
por
more
estos acuerdos.
entities, more
En
contracts
otras
covered
palabras,
by these
las reglas del
agreements.
acuerdo
In other words, the
tienen a
rules
repartir
of the
un número
agreement
mayor de contratos
regulate
o de
a bigger
posibles
number
acuerdos.
of
Y otra cuestión que
probable
quiero mencionar que
contracts.
justamente podemos ver acá, donde dice artículo 9,
Here,
artículo
when you
6,
say Article 9,
esto hace
Article
referencia a los
6,
artículos específicos del ACP.
this
Estos
refers
documentos
to
son una
specific
copia
articles
de
of the
cuestiones que están en ACP y
GPA.
que fueron
That
trasladadas
is to say
directamente a estos
that the
acuerdos. Por ejemplo,
specific
en cuestiones
parts
de
of the GPA
especificaciones
were
técnicas, la
taken and
documentación
incorporated
requerida,
into these agreements. For example, the
selección,
technical
licitación
documentation,
restringida, la contratación
whether
directa,
it's a
las
limited
lo relacionado a
bid,
transparencia. Y también vemos por
transparency,
último
and
que en
others.
ciertos casos ellos también
And you can
incluyeron
see that in
estos
many
acuerdos. Por
cases,
ejemplo, tenemos el
they have
caso, por
included
ejemplo, del acuerdo
new
Estados
notions. For
Unidos-Chile, que había
example,
mencionado
Chile
anteriormente,
and the
que
United
sí
States, as I
contienen, por
mentioned
ejemplo,
before,
disposiciones
has
específicas anticorrupción, así como
provisions
también
against
disposiciones
corruption
específicas
and
de
also
otros países en lo
specific
que sería la
provisions
facilitación e inclusión de pymes en el
in
mercado de
terms
compras
of
públicas.
facilitation and
Así que
inclusion
un
of
buen ejemplo para ver cómo todo
SMBs
lo que
in
hablamos
PP.
se encuentra plasmado en los distintos acuerdos.
All that we have said appears in the
Bien, ahora
different
veamos
agreements.
cuáles son
And now
consideraciones
we're
de
going to
base de
see
estos acuerdos para la región.
policy
En
considerations for the
muchos países
Andean
de la región de
region.
Latinoamérica están
Many countries in
reformando
the
sus
region
sistemas de compras
are
públicas.
reforming
Estos
their
acuerdos
government
lo que
procurement
pueden hacer
system. These
generalmente es,
agreements
al tener en cuenta estos acuerdos al momento
take
de
into
la
account
reforma,
at
sin
the
tener
moment
ni
of
siquiera
the
la
reform,
obligación de unirse a estos o sin considerar unirse a estos, estos
without
pueden
having the
ya dar
obligation of
sugerencias
becoming
de
a
modelo o
member
de mejores
or a
prácticas
party
que pueden
of
ser ya
this agreement,
incluidas en esta
they
reforma.
may have
Entonces,
a
al
model
momento que
or
estos
good
países
practices in mind.
negocien la
When
adhesión
countries
al TPP
negotiate
o
the
negocien
accession to
capítulos
the
en materia de compras
GPA,
públicas,
or
los
for example, the
estándares mínimos
chapter
ya se
dealing with
encuentran
PP,
observados
the
y no hay
minimum
necesidad de hacer
standards
reformas adicionales al sistema de compras
are
públicas.
there and
Cabe
no
mencionar que con, por
modifications
ejemplo,
or
buenas
changes
compras
have to be
públicas, buenos
introduced.
regímenes de compras públicas y
With
transparencia, también
good
esto
regimes
lleva a
with
una mayor adición de
transparency,
crecimiento, no
that
solamente para el comercio, sino
entails
también para el desarrollo del país.
development
Y
and
también
growth
estas
in the
obligaciones
country.
internacionales
And these
pueden ser
international obligations
un empujón adicional
may be an
para el país
additional
en caso que la
push
reforma
to
todavía no
reform
está
the
prevista.
country if the reform has not been
Y bueno,
planned yet.
replicando un poco lo que había dicho anteriormente, la
Going back
apertura
to
del
what I
mercado
said
es
before,
solamente la punta
open
del iceberg.
markets is just
Hay
a
mucho
tip
más
of
que
the
el
iceberg.
aspecto comercial, el aspecto
There are
de la
many
apertura de
other
los mercados.
aspects
Vemos que
other
con la
than
apertura de los mercados
trade.
tenemos más
When you open a
competencia a
market, you
través
have
de
more
otras,
competition
lo cual puede
because you have
llevar
new
a
actors in the market.
el mejor gasto del dinero público, beneficios para los
Public
consumidores
spending
con
is
mejores
better.
bienes, mejores servicios, mejor
Consumers are
infraestructura,
benefited with better goods
mejor
and
nivel
services,
de colegios,
better
escuelas
infrastructure,
y de
better
hospitales.
schools
Vemos también
and
que al seguir
hospitals.
ciertos estándares mínimos, vemos que hay
And
una
with the application
disminución
of
de la
minimal
corrupción,
standards,
al
there
tener
is a
también
reduction of
fortalecidos
corruption
sistemas de impugnaciones o
because there are
sistemas de monitoreo.
systems
Vemos
for
también que se reduce la
bid
burocracia para finalmente
protest,
facilitar la inversión extranjera,
and red
lo
tape
cual nos
is
lleva a crear
limited to
un
facilitate
ciclo virtuoso.
foreign investment.
Entonces,
So
vemos
what
que
do you
provocando
generate?
estos ciclos
A
viciosos nos encontramos
virtuous
con los mercados
circle.
cerrados. Los
What
mercados
we
cerrados
have
llevan
to
a
eradicate
mayor burocracia, menor
vicious
número de
circles because
participantes, posibilidad de
closed
corrupción entre los
markets
mismos participantes porque ya se
entail
conocen todos.
corruption,
Y vemos que
fewer
con la
number
apertura del
of
mercado vamos a crear
bidders,
ciclos virtuosos. Así
and
que
with
la
opening the
reforma
market,
puede llevar
you
a reducir los
enter
niveles de corrupción,
into this
crecimiento
virtuous circle.
económico,
You
interés, lo
reduce
cual se puede generar
corruption,
interés de nuevos
grow
inversores y socios comerciales
development, and
distintos a los que
there's
hasta ahora
growth.
habíamos hablado y
And
habíamos firmado acuerdos
as
internacionales, lo cual a su vez va a
we
llevar
do when
entonces
we
a una
sign an
buena
international
comparación
agreement,
a la posibilidad de
this is
abrir
going to
mercados
entail the
a
appearance
nivel
of new
regional
investors,
o
and
incluso
the
global.
markets are going to
Bueno,
access
con esta
new regional and
introducción
global
de lo que
markets. So
serían los
with
acuerdos
these
y las
ideas,
disposiciones que podemos encontrar en los acuerdos o
we
capítulos en materia de compras
close this
públicas,
section devoted
llegaré a
to
hablar un poco de las
clauses.
medidas de
And now
transición que había
I'm
mencionado
going to
antes,
speak about
antes de
transition or
volver a darle la
temporary
palabra a Rob, que nos
measures.
va a hablar sobre los beneficios y los costos de adherirse
So,
o de
Rob,
firmar
you are going to
acuerdos
speak about the
con
benefits and the
capítulos en
cost of
materia de compras
accession.
públicas. Rob ya nos habló anteriormente de
Rob
cómo
told us
quiénes son
before
las partes, quiénes son los miembros del
about
ACP.
the
Pero yo
members
solamente
to the
quiero mencionar
GPA. I
o
just want to mention here,
iluminar dos cuestiones.
or to shed
Uno,
light
que
on
de
some
los países que
topics.
están
One,
intentando o que están
the
en negociaciones
countries
para adherirse, vemos muchos países
that
que
are
son países que están en vías de
undergoing
desarrollo. Vemos
accession
también que estos países en vías de desarrollo
processes, they are
están
developing
buscando
countries,
ser parte de la CP por una
and
cuestión
they
de
seek
reformas
to join the
internas
GPA
y buscar ya
due to
directamente
domestic
adherirse a lo que
reform,
sería el estándar de
and they
buenas
want to
prácticas a
adhere to
nivel
the
internacional.
standard of good
A nivel internacional
practices
tenemos
at
dos
an
buenas
international
prácticas,
level. We have
dos buenas
two
guías, vamos a decir. El ACP y Rob
guidelines.
mencionó la del
One
modelo
is the
bilateral. Ambos son
GPA, and the
fuertemente
other is the
utilizados
UNCITRAL
para
model
que
law.
el día de mañana,
Both
cuando
of them
ambos
have been
sean aprobados,
harmonized
sean adoptados, el comercio
so that when
internacional
they
ya
are
no los innecesarios
adopted,
para la apertura de los
we
mercados.
don't have
Vemos también
unnecessary
que de las
barriers
claves
for market
en los últimos años, en los
openness.
últimos 6 años, se han
Over the
adherido tres
last
países
6 years,
Latinoamérica.
we have 3
Colombia
Latin
es el
American members
primer
that have
país de
acceded.
Latinoamérica
Colombia
en
is the
convertirse en
first one
observador. Y como dijo
in
Rob,
becoming an
sería
observer,
Brasil en este
actually.
momento se
And as
encuentra en
Bob
una etapa
said,
que
even
no
though
está
Brazil
siguiendo con las negociaciones,
is not moving forward on their negotiations. Their application is still there, so in the future they might resume the process and eventually become the first country in the region to accede to the GPA. Now, flexibility for developing country and least developed countries. Article 5 says that the parties can render special attention to the commercial needs or trade needs of these less developed countries so that they can agree upon certain transitional measures over a period that takes no longer than 5 years. What do I mean by this? That countries that have transfer programs that require some offsets can continue using those measures for a period not exceeding 5 years for least developed countries and 3 years for developing countries. The purpose of this is for the adoption of the full text does not create a barrier to growth and affect the companies that are working domestically. These offsets can continue over a period of time. This allows for the phasing in of new entities. We have a certain number of entities and their accession shouldn't be absolute from day one. Some of them can become covered within the GPA after some time that has been negotiated by the parties. Over this period of time, the thresholds can be higher than the minimum that has been established, and we can defer implementation that ranges between 3 or 5 years. All of these depends on the parties' negotiations and the good negotiating skills of these officials that can attain the goals of acceding to the GPA and use this GPA flexibility. Now, then we see some provisions. I covered the transitional measures, and now I give the floor to Rob, who's going to speak about the costs and some other additional benefits of acceding to the GPA. Rob, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Antonella. That was really great. And and for everyone's assurance, now there's only 3 or 4 slides left in our whole presentation. So I have one slide on potential benefits of GPA accession for emerging and transition economies, developing economies, and one slide on the costs that may be involved. And what I would like to suggest to you, first of all, I hope this will be of interest to you, because I still hope, for example, as I've said, a country like Colombia, because of its FTAs with the United States and the European Union, basically has already accepted the GPA disciplines and adapted its system. In the same way, Peru, being a member important member of the CPTPP, has also adjusted itself and adapted itself to these same principles. So I personally don't think it's such a giant step that you can't imagine joining the GPA. But still, it's your choice. All I'm trying to do here is to give you a kind of framework that you can use to assess potential benefits and costs. And I would like to suggest to you, even though I'm focusing mainly on the GPA here, but the same kinds of factors, all of these factors are highly relevant also to deciding whether you want to enter into a regional agreement on government procurement, or a future bilateral agreement on government procurement, the considerations are very, very similar. Okay, so here, basically, I developed these slides when I was still working in the WTO. I just woke up one day and said, you know, I want to be able to condense into 2 slides the possible benefits and the possible costs of joining the GPA, just to help people think about these issues. So the first possible benefit is the potential trade gains. This is what you would expect. In fact, sort of in the old days, 20 years ago, we might have thought of this as the only possible benefit. Now we have a much more holistic appreciation of the potential benefits of this, which we'll come to. But still, the number one thing that everyone thinks about is potential trade gains. What that means is that suppliers in your countries would be able to bid on contracts in the United States, but also in all the European countries or EU member states, I should say, also in the United Kingdom, also in Canada, also in Japan, Korea, and in the future, hopefully Brazil. So that's, and that opportunity, you know, the payoffs from those winning some of those contracts can be really quite significant. So that's one thing, the first thing to think about. Now, the second thing to think about, which I personally think is actually even more important, is what we refer to as the possibilities for achieving enhanced value for money in the exceeding country's own procurement systems. Okay, and this is something we've been saying all along. You might be saying to yourself, how does that really work? Is it magic? Can I expect this? Is it guaranteed? Well, I wouldn't say it's guaranteed, but I would say it is likely to result as a byproduct of acceding to the GPA. And it works through 3 or 4 mechanisms. One is, and strengthens transparency in the exceeding country's procurement system. Number 2, it strengthens competition in the exceeding country's procurement system, especially for the high value contracts, like let's say a big bridge that you may be building, or constructing a new airport, creating a national hospital system. You know, these are the high value contracts where there will be enhanced competition from joining the GPA. And competition is, of course, a major driving force in enabling us to get best value for money in public procurement. And also, so strengthen transparency, strengthen competition. And we believe that it also, joining the GPA also reduces your vulnerability to corruption and supplier collusion. Supplier collusion, I think it's the first time I've mentioned this in this session. So supplier collusion is when suppliers meet secretly to rig bids. This is a very, very harmful practice, yet it's something that occurs in most procurement systems, at least from time to time. So you might say, well, how does joining the GPA help me with that? Well, it does it in 2 ways. One is it enhances the number of contractors that will be bidding on these high value contracts. That in itself makes collusion more difficult. Okay. And number 2, it actually subjects your procurement system to a higher degree of international scrutiny. So foreign companies will be watching what's going on in the market. They will be hopefully less inclined to participate in collusive schemes, and more willing to risk going to the complaint office to make a complaint. So this is kind of the way that works. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, and this is the second slide on benefits, and then I have one slide on costs. So the next potential benefit, which I think is very important, and that is increased incentives for inbound foreign direct investment. Okay, and this is something, foreign direct investment is a main driver of growth in today's global economy, even despite, some of the problems we have in the global economy and, frictions between certain major countries and things like this. Even so, foreign direct investment in host economies is a really powerful tool for growth and for technology transfer and for investment, investing capital and building new factories and so forth in host countries. Now, you might say, I still don't understand. You might say, how does the GPA help me with that? Well, the answer is, so the GPA, there's two elements to the answer. One is that the GPA is all about really safeguards of transparency and non-discrimination. And this is actually something that foreign companies care about a lot. Okay, and so when economists do sort of surveys of what are the factors that lead international companies to invest in host economies, one of the main things that multinational companies care about is guarantees of transparency and fair treatment. And that is what the GPA gives you. And I believe it can be a powerful force in this respect. And actually, I think this is one of the main reasons why some of the small economies, in the GPA, sure, we have large economies like the United States, like the big EU member states, like the United Kingdom. Those are all big economies. But we also have a good number of small economies that have joined the agreement. Armenia, Moldova is a tiny country. Montenegro is another very small country. All of these countries have joined the GPA recently. And I think it's actually mainly because of this point, because it gives them, it shows the world that they are committing themselves to these standards of transparency and non-discrimination, and thereby helps to generate interest in investment in their economies. Last 2 points, actually Antonella mentioned this in passing, which is very good. One is that once you come into this agreement, you will have the opportunity to influence the terms of other parties' accessions. Okay, so for example, and I'm just saying this hypothetically, imagining it, let's say Colombia would join the GPA next month. Once it joins the GPA, then it has a say in concluding the terms of other Latin American and other countries that come into the GPA. Okay, this is the way that the accession system works. And you also have an opportunity to influence the future evolution of the agreement. Remember, I said that, over time, the GPA, it's a built-in commitment in the agreement to its progressive modernization and adaptation to future terms. So once you're in it, you also will contribute to that process as well. Okay, next slide, please, Antonella. And we've come close. But I'm sure some of you might be thinking, and it would be perfectly reasonable to say, well, Mr. Anderson talks a lot about the benefits, but aren't there costs? Well, you're right. There are potential costs. There are potential costs. And that's what I'm talking about on this slide. By the way, and I want to make a point here, in my view, and this is my advice to all of you, I don't want you to just to take my word for it regarding these benefits and costs. And when I have this list of benefits and costs, it's really just to help you think through this yourself for your own countries. Would it be a good step or not to join this agreement or to enter into a bilateral FTA with similar provisions? I'm just really trying to give you a kind of paradigm or a way to think about that. And I do say, like, these costs and benefits will vary across different WTO members, and it truly, and I'm not saying they'll be the same for, you know, even Peru and Colombia, let alone, you know, Brazil and China. You just have to think through this, and we can discuss this. But what are these costs anyway? Well, I came up with a list of 4 possible costs. One is, and this is the easiest, one is the direct costs of participating in relevant negotiations, okay? This is a cost because it's not just the cost of, you know, flying to Geneva for...
Este es un costo porque no es el que van a encontrar en Ginebra, por ejemplo, las reuniones.
It's also the, you know, you'd probably get some consultants to do studies.
Ustedes seguramente contratarán algunos consultores para hacer algunos estudios.
Meetings. May I just mention, somehow
reuniones
I'm hearing the Spanish on the English channel. And could I just ask Olga or Violeta to, I'm hearing the Spanish on the English channel. Okay, now
okay, I've changed the mic now. I'm very sorry. My mistake.
Not at all. Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, so direct costs of participating in the relevant negotiations. Number 2 is costs of necessary legislative and institutional adaptations. Okay, and what this means is you might have to amend your legislation to bring it into full compliance with the GPA. This is possible. Okay, yet let me respectfully suggest here, I'm guessing that the legislation probably in all 4 of your countries is already pretty much in line with the GPA. And why would that be? Well, in the cases of Peru and Colombia, it's very clear. It's because you've joined these other agreements, and CPTPP and US and EU bilaterals, which incorporate very similar standards. So I think you probably are pretty much already at least those 2 for sure. And I would suggest that even for the others in the Andean region, you're probably, because of reforms you've done, you're probably not as far from being GPA compliant as you might think, okay? Now, the third one is the one that everyone worries about, adjustment costs for local firms and industry, okay? And this is something, you know, to think about carefully. And every time in my former job at the WTO, now I'm fully retired from the WTO, I don't work for them anymore. But in my former job, when I did, every time I went to a country to encourage them to join the GPA, they were all worried about the impact on their local SMEs. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to think about this. Okay, but the only thing I would say, because I really gave some thought to this, you know, first of all, think about things like the GPA thresholds, and Antonella has pointed out that similar thresholds often apply in bilateral agreements, although they may be lower in some cases. Those leave a lot of space for local SMEs to enjoy privileged status in your national procurement systems. So actually the GPA, joining the GPA, its main impact is on the high value contracts. Normally it does not even have any effect, even legally, on the low value contracts, because those are screened out because of these thresholds. And also because local firms in any market have certain natural advantages as well. So even though, what I'm saying to you is, even though all countries worry about this, but in fact, in practice, even with the small countries that have joined the GPA, Armenia, Moldova, Montenegro, they've never come to me and told me that, you know, now French companies get 80% of the contracts or something. It's not the way it works. It really is not. Okay, the local firms will continue to get lots of contracts. And so, and the last one is, like, some countries say that they don't want to participate in the GPA because they want to have the policy space to implement their own sort of procurement preferences. But remember, again, the thresholds actually are intended to give you that space, to give you a lot of space where you can apply preferences if you wish to. And the GPA can also, you know, be a space for improving, you know, the responsiveness of your system in terms of sustainability and so forth. Okay, so these are the costs that I wanted to mention. Summary of main substantive requirements of GPA accession. This part is very easy. There's 4 really requirements to join the GPA. One is the exceeding parties coverage offer, which is negotiated. That's what Brazil withdrew its offer to say, you know, we're going to make a different proposal. That's perfectly okay. Also, any of the special transitional measures that Antonella mentioned, those are negotiated at the same time. The third requirement is consistency of national legislation with the GPA requirements, as we've discussed. As we've discussed, in fact, probably most of your systems are more GPA, closer to being GPA compliant than you might think. And the fourth one is fulfillment of the institutional requirements, by which I mean the domestic review system. And the parties will ask you questions about your domestic review system to ensure that it really is independent and impartial and works effectively. So these are the substantive requirements. Apart from these, there, as I say in the footnote here, there's some formalities. You have to write a letter to the Committee on Government Procurement. Those are truly formalities, and the WTO secretary will advise you on those when the time comes. Okay, and I think we're now, so this is actually the last slide apart from our references at the end. So what I want you to bear in mind here is the relevance of the GPA, of accession to the agreement, and also just of the agreement itself as a driving force for reform. And if you join the GPA, it creates an opportunity for you to update your procurement legislation to include new approaches, methods of procurement, and so forth. It's an opportunity for you to strengthen the use of e-procurement systems, strengthen your data systems and statistics, strengthen the role of your domestic review system and regulatory institutions. And in a very important way, it is a way to gain international recognition. And because the GPA parties do look on the GPA as kind of the gold standard internationally. And some countries do. I mean, as I say, Armenia, Moldova, Montenegro, even Ukraine, which obviously Ukraine has lots of problems right now, but Ukraine joined this agreement as a way of signaling to the world that it wanted to grapple with corruption problems in its system and to adapt itself to best practices internationally. So yes, so that's the idea. Just if we go to the next one, Antonella, and this is just a list of references on, you know, and I'm happy to make these available through to INTAL and through Veronica. Except the third one is a book. I can't make that available, but the others are articles that are linked. So that's available to you. Okay, so really, thank you, Veronica. for the privilege of making this presentation with Antonella. Thank you, and thank you to the participants for hearing us out. And Veronica, I think we're now going to, we can either go to any questions, but I think we're going to go first to Mr. Bonilla. Isn't that right? Or anyway, up to you. Over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Antonella. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. If you agree, while the attendees may think about their questions, they may raise their hands or write their questions in the chat box. Now I'm going to introduce Mr. Alejandro Bonilla. He has a degree in economics from the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana from Mexico, and he is a member of the Latin American Integration Association in the area of agreements and negotiations from 2009 and 2009 in the Government Procurement Policy Unit of the Public Administration of the Ministry of Mexico. He led Compranet, the electronic procurement system. He had several roles in the government procurement area, and I would like to highlight, since 1998, he's been a negotiator of the public sector procurement chapters in several free trade agreements to which Mexico is a party, from various positions and being a secretary of some of them. He's worked also at the Ministry of Economy and Foreign Affairs and Public Administration. He taught for more than 5 years at the National Institute of Public Administration and is currently part of the teaching staff of the International Trade Negotiations Diploma offered by the Colegio de México. Mr. Bonilla, you have the floor.
Bien, muchas gracias, Verónica. Es un gusto estar con ustedes. Agradezco la invitación.
Thank you, Veronica. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I thank the INTAL for the invitation they have extended to ALADI and to provide our analysis in this area, which is so interesting for all the specialists at this meeting. As a negotiator representing Mexico, I concluded the negotiation representing Mexico in 2018, also in the TPP with Latin American countries, with Japan, Israel. So that gave me the opportunity to become acquainted with different schemes, with different domestic legislations, and the interest of the domestic negotiators who participate in the negotiating process. I could witness the interests defended by the public sector and the private sectors in a comprehensive process of negotiation. There are other bilateral topics on the agenda, and I would like to share some of these ideas with you. ALADI, which is an association with 13 countries in Latin America, stands for the formal participation of its parties and takes advantage of the opportunities to disseminate these projects we have in terms of PP, and we pay attention to the advantages and the opportunities that may emerge in this field at international level. I'm going to share with you a presentation which includes the conclusions in an orderly and clear fashion, as Mr. Anderson and Antonella have presented so marvelously. First, I'm going to share this mosaic with some notions that have appeared in this meeting and at previous meetings. We shouldn't be shy. We have to realize that our work in terms of PP has dealt with all these notions, not only representing the government, but also civil society and consumers. The population in general, either directly or indirectly, is going to be benefited or not by these endeavors.
So I'm speaking about a critical analysis to identify and improve the specific conditions, the living conditions of the communities at large. So this mosaic should give us food for thought, and this is the work we do in terms of GP or government procurement. The status of ALADI's members for government procurement in different international agreements. We mentioned the relationship and the existence of different tools that have a different approach but similar outcomes. Today, we have some agreements in our 13 countries, member countries within the ALADI. ALADI is more than 600 million users and consumers, accounting for 5% of the international GDP. In that sense, it becomes, government procurement becomes relevant. We know that over the last years, either fortunately or unfortunately, in some countries, we've seen some experiences where the efficient and timely provisioning of inputs, health inputs or products in the recent health crisis for the COVID, the GP chapters should have shown their leverage, their power, the virtues of having these tools that by reducing uncertainty between tenderers, suppliers, and buyers, this reduces the transactional costs and reduces the uncertainty for companies that they naturally have through costs that impact the public treasury, and also they can weaken the chances of populations to be served in their basic needs. So, along these lines, I created this chart where you can see most of what was said this morning. To the left, we see the 13 member countries to ALADI. In the central column, we see how they stand against the GPA in the Brazilian case. I know they are negotiating their accession. Rob has discussed this, and Antonella as well. They described a Brazil-specific situation, but we can see that most of ALADI's countries are observers, and they have been observers in their discussions. And to the right, you can see that the rights and obligations in terms of government procurements, all of us know in many countries, these are heavily restricted markets internationally.
nacionales, entonces, bueno, pues
So
podemos en este caso
we can see here
observar que la mayoría de
that
los países de la región
most
están
of the
directamente
countries
o
in the region
de
are
manera
directly
multilateral
or
correlacionados
multilaterally
con estos
related
compromisos.
to these
En el marco
commitments.
de la Asociación Latinoamericana de Integración vamos a encontrar
And
acuerdos que
within
son
the ALADI,
regionales,
you
es
will see
decir, en los
regional
que
agreements,
participan toda
and
la
I mean
membresía de la
all
asociación, los 13
the ALADI
países,
members
pero
participate
también
here,
vamos a
the 13
identificar la
countries, but
existencia
we'll
de
also
acuerdos
see
de alcance
some
parcial, es decir,
other
donde solo participa un
agreements with a
conjunto de
partial
los
scope,
países miembros.
where just
Estos
a
acuerdos
subgroup of member
de
countries
alcance parcial
participate.
regularmente están fundados o
These
se reflejan, el
agreements
resultado es un acuerdo de complementación económica.
are
Esa
kind
es
of a
el
complementary
acrónimo
economic
ACE, los
agreements.
acuerdos de
This is
complementación
ACE,
económica, que son
economic
seguidos por un número,
supplementation or
regularmente en
complementation
términos
agreements
el
with a
periodo en
number.
que se van incorporando al registro y al acervo de la asociación.
This
Entonces,
is
cuando ustedes
the
ven
period
aquí
when they
que
accede
Argentina
or they
tiene en
become
el
a
marco
member
del Acuerdo
of
de
ALADI.
Complementación
Argentina
Económica
has
35
the ACE
disposiciones sobre
35,
contratación
and it has
pública, vamos a
provisions on
encontrar
government
que
procurement, and we'll
esta
see
existencia de compromisos en la materia tiene que
that these
ver con
commitments
Brasil,
relate
también
to
encontramos el
Brazil
ACE
because
35,
they also have
Chile,
ACE
tenemos aquí
35
la
and
cifra
Chile
del
as
ACE
well.
35, entonces esto nos deja ver claro
So
que entre
this
Argentina y
lets
Brasil,
us see that between
entre
Argentina,
Chile y
Brazil,
Argentina
or
y Chile y
Chile,
Brasil,
Argentina,
en
and
el
Chile and
acuerdo
Brazil,
35
in
de la
Agreement
Asociación
35
Latinoamericana de Integración, ya están
within ALADI,
disponiendo de
they already
criterios, de disposiciones en
have
materia de contratación
criteria
pública.
and provisions in terms
Igualmente,
of
en la
government
región existe el
procurement.
protocolo del
In the
Mercosur en
region, we
materia
have
de
the Mercosur
contratación, del cual
protocol for
Argentina,
procurements,
Brasil,
and Argentina, Brazil,
Paraguay y Uruguay
Paraguay, and
forman
Uruguay
parte de estos
are
compromisos. Es decir, ya
parties to these
encontramos,
commitments.
además
So
de los acuerdos de complementación
aside from
económica,
the
también otros
ACEs, we
instrumentos
see
regionales
other regional
que
tools
conforman esta red
that
de
make up this
vinculaciones internacionales entre los
relationship
países de la
international
asociación.
network
Ya se ha
among
hecho
the
también mención
countries
en el
within
caso de la
our
Alianza del
institutions.
Pacífico, del cual
We
son
mentioned
parte
the Pacific
Chile, Perú y
Alliance, that where
México de la
Chile,
región
Peru, and Mexico
y cuyo
participate
instrumento
in the
dispone
Latin
de un
American region,
capítulo
and
profundo,
they have a
avanzado y moderno en
specific and
materia
deep
de contratación
chapter
pública.
on
El Acuerdo
government procurement.
Progresista de Asociación
The
Transpacífico, que también ha sido ya citada en varias
CPTPP
ocasiones
has
en
been
esta
mentioned
sesión,
many
bueno, pues
times in
también vemos
this
que
session.
México,
We see that here,
fíjense
that
que Chile,
Mexico,
México
Chile,
y
and who
Chile,
else?
México y Perú,
And Peru,
también ya tenemos, además de la posibilidad de haber
they have
definido en acuerdos bilaterales
defined
disposiciones, ya
bilateral
somos parte,
agreements. They
son
also
parte
have,
de instrumentos regionales
they
que
are part of
aseguran
regional
el
instruments or
cumplimiento
tools that
de las
ensure
obligaciones y por
the
tanto de las
enforcement of
posibilidades de
obligations
intercambio
and
en materia
therefore
de
the
bienes,
exchange possibility in
servicios y
terms
obra
of goods,
pública entre los
services, and
diferentes gobiernos.
constructions
Entonces, esta
among the
lista no es
different
exhaustiva.
administrations or
Lo que
governments. This
quise
is not
manifestar en
an
esta es
exhaustive or complete
precisamente
list.
que ilustrara
I just wanted
que
to
la
show you an
mayoría de los países
example
de la región
to
ya
show how
tenemos
most of the
por más
countries in the
algún
regions
instrumento que nos
do
lleva
have a
a la
tool
implementación, que nos llevó a la
leading
negociación, nos llevó
to
a la
the
implementación y hoy nos
implementation
lleva
and
al
negotiation,
cumplimiento
and
de
today
derechos y
leads us
obligaciones
to
en materia de contratos
enforcing the
públicos.
rights and
¿A qué nos
obligations in
referimos?
government
¿Cuál es el
procurements.
alcance de estos derechos y
What do I
obligaciones
mean by the
descritos en la
scope
tabla?
of these rights
Bien,
and
pues
obligations described in this chart?
particularmente en el caso
Particularly
de los países de la comunidad andina, y
for
ese es
the
un
Andean
extracto del
countries,
cuadro anterior, en el
I
caso
have
de Bolivia,
summarized the prior
Colombia,
chart in
Ecuador y Perú,
Bolivia, Colombia,
podemos
Ecuador, and
encontrar que
Peru.
hay
We can
acuerdos, hay
see
socios comerciales
that there
que
are
de manera
trade
común ya
partners
incluyen
that
temática relacionada con
include
contratación pública.
government
Están
procurement
marcados en color
provisions,
rojo
and they are
la
in
Unión
red
Europea,
here.
Reino
The European
Unido, la Asociación
Union, the
Europea
United
de Libre
Kingdom,
Comercio,
the European
cuyo
Association of Free Trade,
incidencia en las
they have influenced the domestic government procurement system, and it's having positive implications in 3 of the Andean countries. In Bolivia, I have seen no specific commitment at a bilateral basis, but Decision 439, with a general framework of principles and standards for liberalizing trade in services in the Andean communities, saying that the procurement of services by government entities or public entities in the member countries will be subject to the principle of national treatment among the member countries. So, what do I mean by this? The measures that Bolivia should have in order to guarantee national treatment to the other Andean countries in terms of procuring for services supposes that by definition they should include their domestic legislation to guarantee compliance by companies and foreign suppliers. They should be given national treatment among member countries. So this quote in the last column that cross-cuts the 4 countries shows us how familiar the countries are regarding the international commitments. Some of them are deeper, such as bilateral agreements, but I repeat here, they mean to guarantee national treatment in procuring for services. So we imagine that in their domestic legislation, they have provisions to guarantee so. So this should be aligned or compatible with commitments that other countries already have to implement other wider scope tools. This lets us see that all of us have common things, common threads to follow, common paths to apply government procurement provisions internationally. What does it mean in terms of impact and procedures or contract performance? Some decades ago, I can personally tell you that discussions were about the possibility of having enforcement for some criteria that international agreements, that was a GPA, was a benchmark. The agreements between Mexico and the United States were agreements that were there. They were a benchmark. They were present in negotiation tables because they were, again, a benchmark determining how countries should interpret these mechanisms and how they could influence the domestic agenda to make reforms in terms of government procurement. I bear witness to the fact that these domestic mechanisms were limiting government procurement provisions in some agreements. Fortunately, the domestic agendas in terms of giving transparency and efficiency and to promote competition and guarantee the best conditions to use the public monies have led us to the fact of having synergistic domestic legislations that is compatible with or consistent with international agreements. So it's almost kind of standardized. So these tools some years ago were creating a lot of noise and trouble in international commitments. In this chart, I have grouped some of the main provisions. In green, you see the spaces and agreements where we do have these provisions and disciplines. And I would say that almost in an identical manner. Maybe the wording is different, but they have the same impact in procurement mechanisms. We see some ACEs, the Economic Complementation Agreements, that I showed you before. Who are member to them? We have the Pacific Alliance. We have agreements with the European Union. In the Andean community, we saw the elements that are homogeneous as trade partners. So I thought it would be interesting to include here the European Union, the Trans-Pacific Agreement, the Mercosur Protocol, and I wanted to include the WTO GPA. This is consistent to what we have heard so far during this morning. So we see here, we are very happy to see actually that these elements are common, they are standardized. Today, they have been negotiated and implemented, enforced in domestic procurements within the region. So, I'm not going to describe all these topics in details: national treatment, rules of origin, offset mechanism. I mean, the ultimate goals of each measures or disciplines. Now I go to the next slide.
This slide complements the previous one, and you see here other elements which are frequently found in the different agreements and in PP. I'll stress one idea which has already been mentioned, which is transitional measures, which are identified in some agreements, such as, for example, the Mercosur Protocol, but which has an equivalent consequence as the special and differentiated treatment for developing countries and less developed countries in the WTO balance. So, for those countries which so require, and I stress this, so require, these countries incorporate at the negotiating table these notions to safeguard their needs or the production and administration sector of the countries when complying with the agreement is involved. In this way, competition, the incorporation of new players in the field, are considered by all the productive sectors of the parties. On many occasions, complying with the agreements entails or does not entail what the domestic industry consider that has to be included in the negotiating process. I believe that in the Q&A period, we will be able to go back to one of these ideas if the audience deems this interesting. All this takes us to the challenges faced by public procurement. We are surrounded by regional colleagues, we share defensive interests, how the different teams are integrated, what the behavior is, the synergies which appear related to public strategies and policies. So I would like all this to take us to deep reflections. From my point of view, in public procurement, the primary objectives and the secondary objectives have to synergize so that most of the economic actors win. On many occasions, these primary and secondary objectives in PP lack correspondence. They inhibit each other. And this means that many lose. What do I mean by this? Users, citizens in general, which is, or who are, the ultimate objective of the contract of goods and services performed by PP, they need the initiative of private business, the involvement of those authorities who are responsible for surveillance, the balance in trade negotiations, which sometimes come from the fact that public procurement may empower other benefits which are included in the negotiation. In the region, it is very frequent to hear that businesses do not have the chance to compete in bidding processes with other countries which have more sophisticated ways of doing business. But let me remind you that national treatment and the benefit between two parties includes suppliers, goods, and services covered by these processes. Hence, if the company producing goods, when exporting those goods into others, and those goods have a treatment of national treatment in the basket they are going to offer the different governments, here we find a benefit that perhaps the producer does not or cannot materialize, but these goods integrate the basket that the generators of accumulated supplies provide the different markets. Trade between countries, although it's not registered as public procurement, get or reaps the benefits of public procurement. So they can get national treatment and can participate in the different procedures, as is the case of the United Nations, the United States, and Japan. So let us remember all these ideas when we think about primary objectives and secondary objectives. Those who have been involved in PP do know that on many occasions, when we face that the audio and the video do not match, that is to say that aiming at secondary objectives through PP, for example, technological innovation and fiscal policies, generating employment, promoting SMBs, fostering value chains, and other items which are which integrate the discussion of public policies,
a cuidar, digamos, al proceso de contratación pública, que si
all
bien
this
en muchos
means
casos puede ser un elemento que
that
coadyuve a
on many
alcanzar estos
occasions,
objetivos, en
although
muchas ocasiones
PP may
la
help
agenda en
all our
general
objectives,
y el
there are
ambiente en el
other
cual se llevan
cases
a
in
cabo
which
esta
the
dación
environment in which
de cumplimiento de
negotiation is
objetivos
performed,
secundarios hace que
trying to
descuidemos el
reach
objetivo primario.
secondary objectives,
Estos
may mean
elementos
that we
adicionales, estas
disregard
tareas adicionales
pursuing the
que se
primary
le dan a
objective.
los esquemas de contratación
So
pública
these
muchas veces
additional
tiene una
tasks
inferencia no positiva en el tener las
have
mejores
a
condiciones de
non-positive
contratación, el
implication,
poder tener con oportunidad,
which means
calidad, los bienes y
we
servicios que se
miss an
necesitan para atender
opportunity
las
of
necesidades de la
quality, an
población.
opportunity
Entonces,
to
no estoy con
meet
esto
the needs
queriendo
of the
decir
population.
que la
I do not
comunión entre
mean
objetivos primarios y
by
secundarios es
that
inalcanzable. No. Lo que quiero decir
that the
es que
union, the
deberá
addition
de ser
between these
la
two
articulación
objectives
de
is not
varias
feasible.
políticas y
On the
estrategias
contrary,
públicas
what
las
I'm
que hagan
saying is
que
that
esta
several
combinación de
public
objetivos sea una
policies
realidad y que entonces la mayoría
may
gane. Si no lo
materialize
hacemos nosotros
this
con
summation of
con la
primary and
posibilidad que
secondary
tenemos de
objectives.
incidir en esta definición de estrategias,
As
lo
we
que vamos
have
a
the
estar,
chance to
estar generando en algunos
impact
casos es
the generation
muchos
of
quiebros. Es
strategies,
decir, que no haya
if we
correspondencia
don't
en los
bear all
objetivos
this in
y
mind,
muchos quiebros.
we
Y cuando hablo de
may
muchos, hablo desafortunadamente de
lose or
la sociedad, de los usuarios, de la
we may
ciudadanía,
make
que es la que
users and
mayormente
citizens
se ve afectada
lose,
con estas
because
no
it's
acertadas
usually
decisiones de
citizens and
combinación de
users
objetivos
who are
primarios y
affected
secundarios.
when
Sé que estas
primary and secondary
conversaciones, esto que
objectives
estoy
are not
manifestando puede
attained.
ser disruptivo, no se
I
trata de
know
hacerse,
that
se
all
trata
what I'm saying
simplemente
may
de
be
tener claramente
disruptive,
como
but
operadores
I
en
want
estas
all
decisiones de
of us
contratación
to
pública
clarify that when we are operators
la
in PP,
posibilidad y la necesidad de hacer análisis críticos y objetivos
we
sobre
have
estos dos elementos.
to perform
Actualmente
critical
es
analyses,
innegable la redefinición de la geografía de la producción y de la inversión en el
redefining the
mundo.
geography of
La
production
contratación pública
in the
y la
world is
potencialización de los
essential.
beneficios que tenemos en estos
Empowering of
acuerdos internacionales
multiplying the benefits which come
puede llamar
from
también importante
international
la
agreements.
contratación pública, es decir, la
All
posibilidad de
these
tener
things
acceso a esos
play a
mercados
significant role
ya
because
negociados y ya
we
garantizados
must have an
con
access
los
to these
beneficios que
markets
la
which
reducción de aranceles y otras
have
tantas
been benefited by
disposiciones
the
nos
elimination of tariffs and
ofrecen a
other
nuestros ambientes productivos. Tendremos que
measures which
buscar
favor
pues, ese equilibrio entre
productive
la posición
environments.
ofensiva y
So we
defensiva.
must reach a
Tenemos que
balance
estar
between the
conscientes que
offensive
el
and
tiempo
defensive
en el que
postures.
nosotros nos adhiramos a algunos acuerdos con disposiciones de contratación
When
pública nos
we
va a generar una posición diferente en la
access
región.
a certain
Ya se ha hecho
agreement,
también
we have
mención de
to
lo
remember that
importante
that's
que para el
going to
caso de
entail
atracción de
a
inversión
positive
extranjera
consequence in the region.
representa la
And when we
posibilidad de
try
operar como un
to get
centro de
FDI,
aprovisionamiento de mercados
we are going
extranjeros
to
a
be
los
like
cuales
a core,
otros
like a
países
hub,
no están teniendo ese
appealing
acceso hoy. Eso es uno de los elementos
supplies
que también
from
debemos
abroad.
nosotros ponderar, considerar
All
e
these things,
incorporar
all
en
these
esta
variables have to be
búsqueda de
weighed
equilibrio entre objetivos primarios
when
y
we want to
objetivos
reach
secundarios de
the
las
balance
contrataciones
between
públicas en materia
primary and
internacional.
secondary objectives at
Entonces,
international
siendo
level.
este el escenario que si bien no es catastrófico,
This
mi intención no
scenario
es hablar
does
de
not
lo malo que
mean
se ha hecho,
a
sino es más bien
catastrophe.
hacer énfasis en que debemos de estar
On the
siempre
contrary,
atentos de
what I
buscar
mean is that we
las
have to be
mejores
very
condiciones para
attentive,
la población en
trying to
general.
find the
Todos los
best
sujetos en las decisiones
conditions
de
for
contratación
the
y
population at
estos
large.
años van a ser de mucha relevancia para la
And this
toma de
means that
decisiones.
the immediate future are crucial
Como
for
resultado del
decision
análisis crítico de
making.
los objetivos preponderantes de la contratación pública, yo veo que hay dos posibilidades o
To
dos
highlight,
elementos en los
there are
cuales
two
tendríamos que tomar
elements
una posición.
in which you
Esperar la
have to
eliminación de
take
los
a
gastos
position. So
o propiciar el
to
alineamiento de
wait
las
for the
estrategias con equilibrio.
astrological objects to be in equilibrium or to propitiate the alignment of the strategies. So different viewpoints have to be articulated to benefit the citizens of all the countries and to take actions at the different fora. Fortunately, there are different fora where all these ideas can be debated in order to generate benefits for most of the economic actors in all our countries. So these are the ideas I have tried to present to complement what Mr. Anderson and Antonella have presented. And I would love to entertain your feedback, either from the viewpoint of the negotiator, the public, procurement, community, so that this meeting, which represents a sacrifice to many of you. So let's take advantage of this meeting in which we are so lucky to have the voice or the notions rather of the WTO. Thank you for your attention. And Veronica, I suppose we're going now to start the Q&A.
Like you said, we're open to your feedback, to your questions. Are there any questions? You can raise your hands. You can write your questions in the chat box. Is there any feedback, any question?
Aquí, Verónica, me quisiera indicar que es un foro inclusive de terapia. Esto puede ser un foro de terapia para
this is some kind of a therapeutical forum, so to speak. So let's take advantage of the presence here. Rob Anderson does not work anymore at the WTO. He worked there for 20 years. He's a former official of the WTO. So anything that participants might say is not going to be interpreted as a government position. So this is a course we are all here to learn. So you can ask any questions that you can think of.
Veronica, could I make a point?
Well,
of course, you
can. So actually, I just wanted to respond to Mr. Bonilla and to Dr. Bonilla and to thank him for very insightful remarks, highly complimentary and synergistic with the presentation by Antonella and myself. And I am glad, and really, if I understood correctly, I mean, one of the many points that he made, which is a contribution to the discussion, is to provide further evidence that through different initiatives, the legislation and regulations in Latin American countries has already been brought largely into conformity with the GPA. I do think this is very important common ground in our respective presentations. And I also appreciate, Dr. Bonilla, your bringing in this point about primary and secondary objectives. And I think this is I agree with the points that you make, that a lot of care needs to be taken, and we should never forget that the primary job of public procurement is to deliver goods and services for the benefit of our citizens. And we need to do this. This is the material that we covered in the first session of our series of 4 seminars. And I agree. So that's very important. And everything we've said today about the potential benefits of participating in different agreements should be thought of in light of what we established on the first day when we talked about the critical importance of public procurement for development and the critical importance of the goods and services. After all, when we talk about public procurement, we're talking about essential medicines, we're talking about roads and airports, port facilities, public sanitation systems. All of these things are so vitally important for development and for the well-being of our citizens. So it's this, I thank you, sir. And we need to think about our potential participation in trade agreements exactly with this essential point in mind. So thank you for that. So this is really just a comment, not a question. I appreciate very much Mr. Bonilla having shared his thoughts.
Rob, we do have a question.
Oh, good.
I will translate it to you, but it's related to what's the relation between public procurement and GATS. So maybe you can develop a little bit on Article 13 of the GATT, how it's excluded from the mandate, but at the same time, there is this sort of renegotiation principle that it's embedded in the article.
I'm happy to do that, but if you want to do it in Spanish also, it's perfectly fine.
No, ahead. Maybe you can go in English and then I'll just complement in Spanish.
Okay, good. So basically, the GATS agreement. So again, this is the General Agreement on Trade in Services. So it does have, it has 2 provisions that we need to be mindful of and are quite relevant to our discussion. One is that it contains, one is that it provides for this forward-looking dialogue on services procurement, and this is what the European Union is championing and would like to see carried forward in the framework of the General Agreement on Trade and Services. So but this is only a proposal, and unless the EU succeeds in carrying forward its proposal, and so far it has not succeeded, the other participating countries in the GATS discussions have not agreed to the EU's proposal. And so therefore, at the moment, there is really no substantive coverage of services procurement under the GATS. Antonella?
Things related to public procurement are exempt from the main GATS provisions. This paragraph 2 that Bob mentioned mandates these negotiations, but so far there's no decision being made, and there's a difference between the interpretation, which one or why to include these renegotiations. So in broad terms, public procurement related to procurement for services are exempt from the GATS provisions.
Yeah.
Tolora, he was the one who asked the question and is saying, thank you. We want to close now this course, and now I'm going to give the floor to José Martín Valdés, Services, Inventions, and MSMEs Department in the Andean Community. Can you hear me? Is my mic okay? Good afternoon. These days have been enriching in tackling one of the most difficult challenges facing the Andean community, and that is government procurement. Government procurement drive the well-being of our communities, from acquiring goods and services to global for also essential services and in construction services. So we need to continue working in expanding transparency in GP and also driving efficiency in terms of efficacy and cost in attaining goals. We need to foster participation of SMEs as local entrepreneurs as well, for whom it can be a challenge, but they will drive competitions. To this end, we need to drive programs for SMEs to compete in GP of other states and to become exporters. We need to highlight the continuous work within the CAPEX. That is an initiative whose goal is to open the dialogue and exchange experiences about GP for social and economic development. The way the governments handle GP can impact significantly in effectiveness of GP, and in this way to drive the economic growth of our countries. We want to thank Veronica and the IDB and INTAL for organizing this course, and to all the panelists, Robert, Antonella, Gabriel, Alejandro, who gave us all these insights into government procurement. I want to recognize the officials of participating countries. Their experiences enriched these lessons learned. I want to thank all the participants and all the attendees. Thank you so much. Thank you, Martin, for entrusting the INTAL to lead this training. We are open to collaborate all the time. So finally, I want to give the floor to my colleague, Ricardo Rosenberg, who is the senior economist at the INTAL. Ricardo, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Dr. Valdez. I have to thank Sonsetur and Peru, the Secretariat of Lacan, for having supported us in the organization of this meeting. I would like to thank Robert, Antonella, and Alejandro for their hard work, and also for the other trainers who have worked at these 4 meetings.
Yo creo que también las compras públicas son fundamentales, como se vieron en estos días.
PPE are fundamental for the development of our countries. As we know, there is a trade-off between opening to international markets and, on the other hand, the support to local businesses. This is a trade-off we witness permanently in our countries and in the world. As Mr. Anderson said, countries participate according to the rules by the WTO, and sometimes due to thresholds, this entails that the world is not so competitive as we would like it to be. But the market between other negotiations has been opened in the private market, but the public procurement market has not opened so much as the private market. There is rationale behind all this because there is asymmetry between the suppliers of goods and services from developed countries and developing countries. That's why sometimes they don't want to participate, because this asymmetry in terms of size makes competition difficult to bear. And our businesses sometimes provide world-class services, but they cannot participate in many procurement or many bidders or many bids at international level. As Alejandro Bonilla stated, the good news is that apart from the WTO framework and the GPA, apart from that, we have another tool, which is regional agreements, which may mean a lot of agreement. These are not the agreements of the past, because there's a difference in terms of disciplines and technical matters. In this way, I believe that there might be a convergence between bilateral and sub-regional agreements vis-à-vis the GPA, bearing in mind asymmetries in developing countries and free competition of the markets. That's a reason why this seminar, these 4 meetings, have contributed so much, because now we see this complex with a new perspective. It's a complex challenge we face. I mean, trade-off, transparency, technological tools, all the old topics and the new ones related to markets. We have to recognize these new topics exist and we have to discuss. We would love to listen to the opinions of the officials of the Andean community so as to learn about their opinions and the doubts they have. I suppose that this course is going to open the door for future courses in which we will openly exchange ideas in this relationship between the organizers, the speakers, and the attendees. The number of attendees shows this interest, and that's why we are so happy. And that's why we're looking forward to listening to your opinions when you have the chance to listen to personalities such as Bob Anderson and Antonella Salgueiro. No doubt we will have future opportunities, because this course was organized not because the INTAL people want to do so. This course responds to the interests of the governments of the Andean countries and their interest in learning more about this topic. Without further ado, I would like to thank all the officials, all the attendees, all the representatives of the government, the speakers especially, and on behalf of the IDB, INTAL, and its head, Ana Vasco, I would like to thank the Secretariat of the Andean Community and Martín Valdés particularly. And I'm looking forward to meeting you again. And let me tell you that our institute is a sort of think tank in the Inter-American Development Bank. We have a site which is conexionintal.org, and there you can have access to different newsletters, different data and information monitoring of different topics which are so interesting. We have, for example, regional reports. Central America, Andean community, and the rest, electronic trade, trade and gender, trade and environment. So we would love you to consult those reports. And of course, we are open and we look forward to your initiatives. Governments and intermediary agencies, so that we can take advantage from each other, from this synergy that these meetings create. Thank you, Veronica, for your support, for your endurance as well. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to work with the region and with the speakers with whom we have been in contact for so many years, and it's a pleasure. And now I would like to listen to Rob Anderson, Antonella, and Alejandro to conclude.
So thanks so much. And it's terrific to have these final inputs to the program from the different organizations. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for your comments. And this has been a great set of discussions. We began with the development aspects of government procurement, as we should. I mean, the impact of public procurement policies for development should be uppermost in our mind at all times. And we carried on and we had great discussions on sustainability. And there was a separate one with other presenters on governance and anti-corruption. And now we've had this discussion on potential benefits from participation in different trade agreements. And you know, as a former WTO official, I agree with the point that there's a lot of synergy and a lot of complementarity between bilateral initiatives, regional initiatives, and the government procurement agreement. And it's perfectly reasonable to think initially in terms of bilateral and regional and sub-regional possibilities. This is a great thing to pursue. And it's great also to pursue it with an awareness of the sort of wider context. So I hope we've contributed to that. Many thanks to my excellent co-presenter and colleague, Antonella. Veronica, it's always a great pleasure to work with you. So thanks for organizing this program. And Mr. Bonilla, thanks for your inputs. And well, I look forward to, I hope to meet everyone in person perhaps back in Buenos Aires one day. Antonella?
Thank you. Thank you for joining these 4 sessions. I just want to point out that having worked in both sides of the Atlantic, I see that Alejandro's presentation is so synergistic in terms of all agreements, these complementary agreements, the Mercosur agreements, where we see similar provisions. And finally, the market opening shouldn't be considered as something aggressively affecting domestic markets. Each country has its own development policies for businesses, for sectors and industries, and for SMEs. But by having this type of discussions within the Andean community, the ALADI and the Mercosur, we can identify topics that can be fine-tuned to create further opening, not to limit competition, rather the opposite, to increase competition, to obtain value for money, and provide benefits to the citizens that ultimately are the ultimate beneficiaries of goods, services, and infrastructure projects. Finally, even though we have some questions here, in case you have any additional questions, or if you like to read any documents or papers, you can contact me through the social media, Antonella Salgueiro in Twitter or any other social media, I will be very happy to help you there. Alejandro, I want to thank the possibility of having this kind of meetings for us who love public procurement and international trade. And in ALADI, it's a permanent space for dialogue and to attend to all the concerns that countries have on their agenda. And I want to say that in terms of opening the procurement market, there's not a silver bullet, just one. Each industry has its own needs. Each promotion system or support, and to make domestic agenda consistent, has its own balance. And so we need to pay attention to all these details. So speaking about the benefits that we always need to see, the benefits that are drawn by the openness and the international commitments in GP. In Mexico, we say that we should not neglect the bills by neglecting the coins. We should not lose sight of the forest because of a single tree. That's basically, and this should lead our decisions in terms of public policies. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, everyone.